Good morning. Welcome to our October Environmental Essentials webinar. As is typical, we'll give everybody an extra minute here to sign on, and then we'll get going. In the meantime, we appreciate you taking the time out of your morning to listen to us and share some of the experiences from previous government shutdowns. So we'll be back with you in about 30 seconds. Okay, so once again, good morning. Welcome to the October Environmental Essentials webinar titled Shutdown Averted, at least for now, how SSM impacts EPA. I'll be sharing with you how we get to government shutdowns, a little bit of history on that. I think it's important as we seem to experience these shutdowns from time to time, a lesson on how the government processes work, a brief history of the origins of government shutdowns, and EPA's journey through SSM, which for them is actually MSS. We go through a malfunction, a shutdown, and then the start back up, all which have some unique characteristics. So with that, we shall move right into it. First, it's important for you to understand exactly what goes on in the government when they go through one of these shutdowns. You need to talk a little bit about the government processes and what they have to deal with. In order to conduct business as an agency, you have to have authority. So you need the subject matter authority that can derive from constitutional provisions or from statutes that have been passed by Congress. Then you also need to be authorized to use that authority. It may be inherent if it comes from the Constitution, or Congress may authorize it. Sometimes their authorization is temporary or is only for a certain number of years. For example, in this latest episode of government shutdown roulette, the FAA authorization is up for renewal. And part of the continuing resolution included an authorization for the FAA to continue to operate. So when you see those authorization discussions, think of it, if you're from Texas, kind of the sunset review that agencies go through. That's kind of the federal government's view of effort to periodically review the authorization of various agencies. So if you got the authority, the next thing you also need is the money. And the funds need to have been appropriated by Congress, and then they also need to be available. And in some cases, actually obligated is the way the government uses the phrasing onto particular contracts. The other aspect you really need to know is the color of your money. Something I learned as I went into government, that there are different colors of money. And it's very important, particularly when you go through these shutdown processes, to know what color your money is. Some cases, there's what we call no-year money. Typically, Superfund, while it has an annual appropriations, once that money's been appropriated to EPA for Superfund, it is what they call no-year money. It can be spent that fiscal year, the next fiscal year, or 10 years later. But there's no deadline on when it has to be spent. Then there's single-year money. Typically comes through the annual appropriations, and it's got to be spent during that fiscal year for those appropriations. And then there's multi-year money. And many of the grant programs, particularly those created by the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, are monies that have to be spent over a certain number of years. So those are some of the different colors of money, and what happens during a government shutdown is impacted by the color of the money that you're dealing with. So now for the brief history lesson. If you go back to the Constitution, for those of you who have remember your con law class, the appropriations clause says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. So there's the authority for Congress to do appropriations, and it says appropriations that provide the funds to the agencies. We've had funding gaps or accounting snafus, as some have called them, for as long as the country's been around. Pre-Civil War, no one really thought much about it. Congress always eventually got around to lining up appropriations with what the government was doing, and life went on. After the Civil War, there were some issues with, if you will, scandals over funding and things, expenditures during the war. In 1870, the first iteration of the Anti-Deficiency Act was passed. And it's been amended several times since, but the fundamentals of it have been the same. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. During the Depression, things pretty much moved along fairly well during World War II, but post-World War II, it became more difficult as the administrative state grew in the government. It became more of an issue about getting the appropriations bills done each year. And so the ascension of the continuing resolution occurred. In the 1950s, 3 different times, Congress failed to get all the appropriations done by the deadline, which was then July 1 was when the fiscal year started. Appropriations started to get entangled with various hot-button policy issues. We might think of abortion or other types of equal rights, civil rights issues, all started impacting in the appropriations bills, thus making them more difficult to get through Congress. So naturally, Congress's response to missing deadlines was to change the rules and change the deadline. So this is when the fiscal year got moved from July 1 to October 1, thinking this would give them more time. Well, that didn't really work, and into the 70s, more lapses occurred. Yet still no real government shutdown until we got to the end of the Carter administration. In 1979 and 80, Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti wrote a couple of memos. He had been asked by President Carter about what happens when there's a lapse of funds, what authorities are there, what happens. And he gave what he felt was a very straightforward, purely direct opinion on a fairly narrow subject, that indeed the Anti-Deficiency Act caused the government to lose authority to spend money if those annual appropriations were not in place on time. And they came with criminal penalties for those in the administrative state who were running the agencies, and that DOJ would enforce it. That caused a change in the agencies when these came out. Many years later, Civiletti gave an interview in talking about government shutdowns, and he was quite surprised the turmoil and the political hot potato and weapon that it became. He thought he wrote a very clear, just simple legal memo that Congress would figure out how to deal with it and move on. He never envisioned what has become the government shutdown roulette. So here's the language of the Anti-Deficiency Act. It's pretty straightforward, but unless there's other provisions of law, the U.S. government may not make or authorize an expenditure or obligation exceeding the amount available in an appropriation, or involve either government in a contract or obligation of money before an appropriation is made, unless authorized by law. This is the language. It's pretty straightforward, and this lays the foundation for the malfunction. So the malfunction is a lack of appropriations. It's not a latent defect. It doesn't sneak up on people. You see it coming. The deadline's clear. And it happens is with one or more of the 12 appropriation bills. That's how the Congress has chosen historically to break up the appropriations into 12 different bills. If one of those is not passed by 11:59 p.m. on September 30th of each year, there's a lapse. A continuing resolution can be passed that sets a different date, and you can have partial shutdowns, say 4 of the appropriation bills pass. All the agencies covered by those 4 continue on, they're funded for the year. Those who do not have appropriations bills now go through the shutdown process. So what happens at EPA before the actual malfunction occurs? It begins several days, if not a couple of weeks beforehand. The level of effort that's put in is kind of dependent upon the likelihood. Sometimes at the agency, you get surprised. Everybody was convinced 2 weeks ago we were going to have a shutdown, and it didn't happen. Other times they sneak up on you. But if put in kind of a practical company sense, think of a hurricane that's several days away from making landfall somewhere on the coast. You dust off your emergency preparedness plan, think about how you'd handle a hurricane. That's what goes on in the EPA. These plans have been in place for many years, and they need to be updated. In particular for EPA, this year they had a little more difficult task because of the new buckets of money they've been given. So I call the pre-malfunction time, before landfall of the storm, if you will, bucket time. This is the time where you start separating people and activities into two different buckets. Which you'll see in the press sometimes they talk about necessary and unnecessary or essential or non-essential employees. That's not the actual terms in the statute and in the regulations and in the process that's used by the government. There are exempted activities and accepted activities. So exempted activities, that bucket are funds where you have carryover funds. You still have funds available to you to run the agency, or you have unexpired appropriations. So like the no-year money or the multi-year money. That money is still available. You can still do activities covered by those appropriations, or if you have carryover funds. If you call this in the long shutdown I went through in 2018-19, EPA had enough money for normal operations for an extra week before they had to start the shutdown process. This last time, Administrator Regan indicated they had enough money to at least run for another week. Other exempted activities, you may have a money source other than annual appropriations. The Supreme Court has a permanent fund, and they work off of that, so they are not as impacted by the lack of annual appropriations. So that's one bucket. Another bucket is accepted activities. These are activities that are necessary to perform the activities that are expressly authorized by law. So that's an implied accepted activity. If the law allows this activity to continue on, well, obviously the support functions to allow that to happen are deemed to be accepted. So you think about mission support functions. When we talk about EPA, the activities that occur on the first day of the shutdown fall in this category, and longer term shutdown activities. Activities necessary for the discharge of the president's constitutional duties will be an accepted activity. Typically, there's at least one person in each agency that's designated to be there to help the president carry forth their constitutional duties. And if it's necessary to protect life and property, and this is the exception that a lot of EP activities will fall into. Notices are prepared to go out to employees as to which bucket they're in. Are they going to be allowed to come to work to do exempted activities or accepted activities, or are they going to be furloughed? You also have to go through and match all the activities of the agency to understand what the color of money. And that occurred with the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law. You had a lot of new buckets of money that they had to go through and figure out whether they fell into exempted or accepted activities, or they'd be subject to furloughs. What you also don't see is that travel limitations get put in place a week or so before the potential shutdown. That's to avoid having a stranded employee who is out at a remote area and now no longer can take official government travel after the shutdown. Meetings may be postponed. So some of you may have wondered, why did a particular meeting get postponed or a conference canceled? This may be one of the reasons, as they were preparing for the shutdown. Well, now we get to the malfunction has occurred. So this is the first S. This is the shutdown. We have landfall of the storm. Day one, there are furlough activities. Everyone comes in and does an orderly shutdown of their computers and other work tasks. It's expected to last no more than 4 hours, and then you go home. Questions that arise about what are the alternate work schedules. People at EPA had 4-day work weeks or came in at different times. And so basically this can be occurring over multiple days as somebody's first day of being on duty, as the government terminology is, or being at work. After this activity is done, unless you are moved to the other bucket of accepted or exempted activities, you have no more contact with work. The computer remains off. You don't get on your email. There are status messages posted on a publicly available EPA website, so you can get to that with your personal computer or phone, or you'll receive a notice at your personal email. Some will get called back for a specific activity. You may need an accountant to come in to authorize funds to get moved to a different account to continue funding for an exempted or accepted activity. Contractors are the ones who really get shorted during this process. If their work requires any interaction with federal employees, their work will stop. For Superfund sites, it's kind of a case-by-case determination. Made at the maximum time, we ended up with over 70 sites where work was stopped during the shutdown in 2018-19. In the first few days, there's an orderly shutdown of other activities. Lab work may take longer than the initial 4 hours on day one to get down, shut down and maintain the integrity of the equipment or the samples. You may have carryover funds in different pockets that will run out at different parts of time. So you'll go through and, some area may be able to run for another 5 days, might be able to go 2 weeks, and then they shut down. Another thing that happens, those that are accepted or exempted or in the office get the important task of watering the plants. This is actually something very important, particularly on longer shutdowns, try to keep the plants watered. From day 6, in our case in 2018-19 to 34 days, you're answering very odd questions. You're continuing as more and more, in our case at Olem, as Superfund sites would ramp down, sites, we would, add them to the list and keep the administrator's office informed about our activities. In our case, we had a number of emergency response folks, and they still continue to work through that. In some cases, some sites work was restarted because there was concern that the length of time was down, that the integrity of the equipment might be at issue. And then there's always more watering. It's always good to have the assistant administrator and deputy assistant administrator walking around the office and keeping everybody's plants alive. Which, just as a little side, became very apparent what happened if we hadn't. When COVID hit and everybody left the buildings for 4 months, when the political team came back, the plants had not been watered and it looked like a little bit of a zombie area at EPA. So the type of accepted work at EPA that will continue to go on, support work for cases with DOJ. The court systems may or may not delay cases, and so to the extent DOJ has ongoing caseloads and they need support from EPA technical staff, that will be accepted. Anything on the law enforcement side, the criminal side, typically continues to go forward. Emergency and disaster assistance. For example, if the government had shut down, the important work that EPA is out there doing in Maui and picking up all the hazardous waste that's from the fire area, that would have continued whether the shutdown work or not. Superfund work, PRP funded sites were less likely to be impacted. They were doing their work and their reports that would be submitted to EPA would be not be reviewed during the shutdown. Where they could get caught up is if they had something that needed to be approved by EPA before they could take the next step. If those workers were not exempted or accepted, then that approval wouldn't occur, and then the PRPs would be stymied and going forward. Some accounting functions are still going on. The IT folks are some of the IT folks are still in to secure the operations. The key factor of how broadly or narrowly you construe accepted and exempted is really a political messaging of the particular administration. During the Obama administration, they wanted to make shutdown somewhat painful to the American people, so they put barricades around the various monuments on the mall there in DC. And the Trump administration, the political messaging was to make it as less painful as possible to the American people. So we broadly construed the authorities we had to keep activities open, actions going, people doing work. Typically what doesn't happen is issuance of new grants typically stops. You might have heard, for those of you interested in different energy projects, the hydrogen hubs announcement might have been delayed if the government was shut down. Payroll processing does not occur. However, in a long shutdown, you may get a free sandwich. During my time there, the long shutdown on Juan Paredes, the world-renowned chef, opened a couple of his restaurants to free sandwiches to government employees affected by the shutdown. And I must admit, I did go get one of those sandwiches and it was quite tasty. Although I did have a fear that if my picture had been taken, a picture of a Trump administration political getting a free sandwich might not have been good to see on the front page of the paper. Um, Website updates don't occur. Research shuts down, publication shut down, civil enforcement inspections cease. There are occasionally some exceptions. Some of the safe drinking water may occur. Permits will not be issued. Approval of state requests will not occur. Personnel hiring doesn't occur. And that includes the White House Presidential Personnel Office, which I can tell you impacted me. There was a very brief 1 or 2 day shutdown in mid-January of 2018. And the day my file was there to be finally approved so EPA could formally hire me, it didn't happen. Government was shut down. They weren't there. It cost me 2 weeks in my job at EPA before it could cycle back around to EPA. It's time with the White House Presidential Personnel Office. So it's important to remember these have consequences to people's lives. Many of the government employees kind of live paycheck to paycheck. They are not getting paid during this time frame. So when the shutdowns are a day or two, not a big deal because payroll will ramp back up and the regular paychecks will catch up very quickly. If it goes on for a month, they've missed a couple paychecks, and that can cause a real problem for some families. Now, another interesting aspect for the government is the second S, the starting back up. This is similar to the restart of a plant after the storm, but it takes some time. And you're going through, you're canceling stop work orders. You're checking the bill conditions before you let people back in, making sure the IT infrastructure is still good. You have to notify the states and grantees that the funds are now available. The most interesting aspect for EPA and most difficult one is that most of the deadlines were not delayed. So just because you weren't in the office for 30 days doesn't mean that the deadlines for rules needing to get out were stayed or the annual grants getting done. The calendar kept moving, and so you now have a more of a compressed time frame to get the regular work done. As we got into the 2018-19 shutdown, got into day 25 or so, we asked the career staff, so what happens next? And they just looked at it and said, we don't know. We've never gone this long before. And so we'll just see what comes up. But they did tell us if they last for longer than a week, it can be as long as 6 months for everything to get back to the normal rhythm and order of business. And I kind of looked at that very skeptically. And really, it takes you 6 months to recover from a 2 week or 3 weeks shutdown. Because I was used to a manufacturing context where you could kind of just push everything back and get up and running and, kind of fill in orders and you could catch up fairly quickly. But in this case, it turned out to be right. It takes quite a bit of time to fit in the work that didn't get done during those 34 days into what already is a full calendar of work to get done over what's remaining of the fiscal year. So it does take EPA quite a bit of time and effort to get back online and adjusting. So that 6 months rule of thumb is good. Now also, there's a lot of concern with folks, they weren't getting paid. Until 2019, back pay was not guaranteed. It was common. Every time there had been a government lapse, employees had been paid in full, even for the time where they weren't working. But after the 2018-19 34-day lapse, Congress did pass back pay legislation to now, by statute, the federal government employees will be paid in full 4 days that they have been furloughed. So that took some of the pressure off. Just reminding folks, the Q&A function is up and running. I say I have a question about whether EPA filed for any extensions of court order deadlines due to the shutdown. Yes, DOJ is actually in charge of filing those. They're the ones who are actually free in federal court. They will file for extensions if they believe it's appropriate and won't be a harm to the case or such. And many are granted, but in some cases they are not. If they are looking at imminent substantial endangerment cases seeking injunctions, DOJ may not, and extensions are at the mercy of the judge. And so the judge, he or she, may not grant the extension. And so if there's no extension granted, then EPA will then fall into one of that accepted category and be there to support DOJ to meet those court deadlines. If it's an administrative settlement discussions you're having and such, unless there's a impact to health and safety or property, EPA will likely postpone those discussions until after the shutdown's over. So thank you for that question. So, you know, as we would go to work, I actually ended up working 12-hour days during the shutdown. I kept telling people shutdown has a different connotation in the government than it did have it at a manufacturing company, where we actually, you know, closed the doors and locked the gates and went home. But at EPA, we were there 10, 12-hour days, answering all these interesting questions that would come in. People, you know, the folks at EPA want to work. They believe in the mission of the agency. They want the work to be done. And so we get questions, well, can we call this accepted work? And particularly given the Trump administration's wanting to keep the impact of the shutdown minimal, we would push the envelope as much as we could, just try to stay within the law. And we'd work with the Office of General Counsel to say, hey, we want to make this call. Do you support us in our interpretation? This falls in one of those accepted categories and such. So your day was taken up with those kind of issues. Then when we get requests from the White House, or, you know, what are the impacts? What have you shut down and such? And depending upon the news cycle of the day and whether Democrats or Republicans are trying to make political points, you would be responding to those queries and feeding information through the administrator's office and over to the White House for them to add to the daily briefings or whatever was going on. So it's not the most exciting work. It was interesting, doing something that had never been done before. Something, however, that there is a lot of efficiency lost when the government is shut down. The 1 or 2 days are just probably nuisances, but the lengthier ones can cause work to get delayed, postpone things, and does have a real impact. But once again, it's up to Congress to appropriate the money, and the Article 2 folks get to wait until that happens. So with that, we appreciate you taking the time today. We're coming up against our 30 minutes. We try to keep these at. A couple of advertisements for you. We ask you that you mark your calendars. Invitations will be going out shortly. November 15th, we'll have our fall environmental law seminar. It'll be all afternoon on the 15th. I believe that is a Wednesday. We encourage you to come in person. One of the highlights we've arranged for a fireside chat with the general counsel of a multi-billion-dollar chemical company. And I think talking with them about the challenges, the legal challenges for facing the energy transition and the new emphasis EPA is putting on with environmental justice and working with communities and such. So we think you'll find that very fascinating, as well as our timely updates on various issues in environmental law. Also encourage you, we have a couple podcasts from the firm. We have our own environmental monitor that Daniel Pope hosts for us. So we encourage you to check that out. And then our policy resolution group hosts a lobby shop podcast. They do great work in DC. They are well attuned to what's going on and such. So I encourage you to check those out. You can find those at wherever you find your other podcasts. And so once again, thank you for taking the time on this morning to learn a little bit about government shutdowns. We encourage you to share this with others once we get it posted up on the website. And once again, remember to mark your calendars and join us for our fall seminar on November 15th. So thank you and have yourself a good day.